For those of you who clicked on the link and signed up for this session because you saw that Jason Warner was going to be running it, I'm sorry to disappoint. It's going to be Levi today. Jason will be joining us in a little bit if he hasn't already snuck in, but I'm going to be actually leading this session. I've also got Jennifer Jordan and Faye Walter helping run some of the backside of things. I don't see anybody in our waiting room, and it is after 4, and I want to value your time as much as possible, so I'm going to go ahead and get us rolling. Start off by introducing myself. My name is Levi Sterling, Senior ATSD for SMU Guildhall. So I'm the new kid on campus. Guildhall, as you may or may not have seen, we just got to move into the lovely Gerald J. Ford Hall for Research and Innovation. It's a beautiful space. If you haven't had a chance to come by and see it, come by and see it. We're pretty proud of it, but we're happy to be on campus. But more importantly, welcome to Taking Attendance in Trying Times, Strategies for Success. I am going to do my very, very best to not use the word unprecedented times at all in this presentation. So for those of you who are playing Zoom bingo, I'm going to try to avoid all those words, but I'm going to hit them at some point anyways, so sorry about that. But these are trying times, especially when it comes to trying to take attendance. This session is going to lay out a spectrum of strategies for taking attendance both in the SMUFlex and the fully virtual courses that faculty can use. They can incorporate these ideas into their instructional planning. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about how to take attendance in a fully in-person class because, well, hopefully we've got that figured out by now. That being said, I'm just going to say my one thing about taking attendance fully in person. And this is slightly off script. Just in case you forgot, don't pass the pen and paper. This is in our COVID resistant times. We are fighting against passing pen and paper around, so let's avoid that. But there's going to be some ideas in here that you can use, or you can pick which ones you like. There's a whole bunch of different things you can look at. Really, it should be based on your discretion and your pedagogical preferences. This is largely based on sort of the faculty feedback from fall 2020. So hopefully it has some clear practical strategies for taking attendance both in large and small classes, and even some specific language that you could use in your syllabus. I will go ahead and lead with this slide will be available later, as will this video. So anything that you want to get from here, you will be able to get later. In order to stay under our 45-minute time limit, we're starting off with everybody muted except me. If you have questions and you want to throw them in the chat, if they're super important that we hit them right at that moment, Jennifer will jump in there and make sure that I don't miss those. Otherwise, we're going to try to hit all of our questions at the end. If your question doesn't get answered at some point during this video, we will reach back out to you and get you an answer for your questions. With that, welcome, and let's get started. So you may or may not have yet seen the university's COVID-19 health statement on attendance. And I'm going to try to take some walls of text. I'm going to throw those walls of text at you, and I'm not going to read them. I'm just going to tell you the highlights from it. So for starters, looking at this, now I'm going to remove some language from this. So let's get to what's really important. Now it's hard to read, so let's clean it up a little bit better. There we go. I've taken the wall of text that we had thrown at us and simplified it a little bit to what is the super important essence of the COVID-19 health statement on attendance. Students who need to self-quarantine or isolate will not be penalized and will be provided appropriate modifications to assignments, deadlines, and testing. So yeah, we could go and read through this whole thing, but we're just going to take the most important part, which is if the students have to do it, then they're going to get the modifications. They're going to get, those changes that they need. How are we going to do that? How does that work? What does that look like? Let's talk about that, especially in regards to attendance. Now, this language is a little bit scary because it sounds like all of a sudden we're opening up the floodgates for, oh no, now students are going to try to run how they want to do things on their time. Don't worry, university thought of that whenever they wrote this up. And there are student requirements as well. The students have to provide advance notification. Students are required to communicate promptly. Students are required to continue participation, and students are asked to consider alternatives. There could be a time that you reach as a student that you have to find alternatives to your current path forward. These are the things that are laid out for the students that they are told that they need to keep in mind and they must follow in order to get the modifications that they need. There are, the best way to say this, there are additional attendance expectations. Faculty, these are the expectations, not just on what you're expected, not just on what the students are expected, but sort of the community agreement. This is the expectations for both faculty and students to come together on, so that they can know kind of what can we expect when it comes to taking attendance. These are a list of things that you can choose to include or not. These are things that, like I mentioned earlier, how your pedagogy works, how your specific class is run, how you interact with your students will dictate which ones of these work for you and which ones don't. These are suggestions. These are things that you can use that will help you take attendance, manage your students in a are they here, are they not here sort of way in these, I didn't say it, challenging times. Participation grades. Now, participation grades, unlike the first time I ever had a car in a Pine Car Derby, does not just mean you get something for showing up. What we're actually talking about here when we talk about participation grades, and some of these are going to be a little bit wordy. They're actually a little more wordy than you might want right now, because I want you to be able to later take these and actually put these into your syllabus. But basically, students will receive up to fill in the blank % of their grades for participation, which includes the following. And you could use all or some of these: providing prompt communication about absences, meeting expectations laid out for agreed upon alternative arrangements, following class participation expectations, providing acceptable forms of documentation for absences. Basically, this is not just participation saying, hey, you can give your students grades for showing up to class. This is literally saying, once you engage the students in helping manage their attendance, not just their attendance being a grade, that's not really what we're saying here. We're saying them managing their attendance, helping with their grade, them getting graded upon, making sure that they communicate with you on time. It's professional communication. It's learning to be a professional, something that we're trying to teach in almost every class anyways. Documentation. The word documentation was hit on the last slide. To push a little further into documentation, what are we talking about on here? Well, there's acceptable forms of documentation for excused absences. We're not talking about a student writing on a Post-it note, sorry, I wasn't here on Monday, I was feeling crummy. No, we're talking really two things: an email notification sent directly to the instructor that a student is in isolation, or an email from the Office of Dean of Students that a student is in quarantine. In the case of a quarantine, the email will come directly from the Office of the Dean of Students to the student, who then forwards it on to the instructor. Use this language in your syllabus, cover yourself, make sure you mention it. That way the students don't later go, oh, I assumed that they emailed you too. Tell your students in your syllabus that they need to forward that on to you as their instructor. If students self-select for quarantine or isolation, they still need to follow the SMU protocol. They will fill out the proper forms, and it will then do the same process. You'll get the same above documentation so that the students can provide it for you. But make sure you include that in your syllabus from the very beginning, that expectation that any documentation the students get, they forward it on to you. Zoom camera expectations. This is one I'm really not going to spend going through everything that is written on there. I'm just going to say, There's a few ways to handle attendance with Zoom. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on how to do a roll call attendance in Zoom because it's just calling roll. It's also a pretty good way to waste time trying to call roll. There's also ways to run reports in Zoom, which are okay. There's some weakness to those, and that people can just sign in and not participate. There's some use to it depending on the class, but particularly if you from the very beginning set expectations for your students whenever it comes to Zoom behavior. Things like, is there an expected number of times for a student to interact with you, to interact with the class? Do you have expectations for students must be on camera? Are there expectations for, students need to not be in bed when they're on camera? Now, students on bed when they're in camera, that's an issue bigger than just attendance, but while you're talking attendance and how you're going to be measuring attendance via Zoom, that's probably worth mentioning. At this point, I would wager to say most folks who have run a class in Zoom have had at least one student that when they looked at the student, they thought, wow, that's really how you're going to do class today. Address it on the front end so that later the students can't come back to you and say, well, you never told me. There is a time when a student might have to have a camera off. There is potentially a situation where a student is in a setting where they simply can't verbally respond, they can't have a camera on, they don't have a camera that's working, they're completely in the dark. There are special circumstances that might come up. Again, tell your students from the beginning to tell you from the beginning. Make sure they're communicating early and often. Like I mentioned before, that part of that participation grade, make sure that your students are letting you know from the beginning. It's a very different conversation when a student says, oh, sorry, I haven't been on camera for the last 6 weeks. My camera doesn't work, versus when they come to you from the beginning and say, hey, on Tuesday, I'm not going to be able to have my camera on because of where I'm going to be for class. Very different conversation, and a lot more understanding can be had between the two of you. Recordings. This one is largely on you. Hit that record button. When it comes to recording your sessions, now there are some guidelines, and if you look through the expectations for recording your Zoom sessions per SMU guidelines, there are actually some times that you might be in a Zoom session that you don't have to record. If you're looking for those, just don't, and go ahead and record your Zoom sessions so long as you have whoever you're with understanding. Now, if you're having a one-on-one call with a student, there's a time to record that and there's a time to not. But if you are having any sort of class session, there's hardly a time that you will say, boy, I wish I hadn't recorded that class. Boy, I wish I hadn't recorded that lecture. Worst case scenario, you end up not using the recording and it just never was used. No one ever watches it, not a big deal. Best case scenario, you're completely covered whenever a student says, hey, I missed out. How do I get that information? So record your stuff. Don't look for reasons, don't look for those loopholes to where you don't have to record. Just record your sessions and it'll make it way easier on you. The way it's currently set up, the way Zoom has the ability to push it over to Panopto and it shows up in your Canvas courses, it's super easy. You don't have to worry about finding your videos later on. If there's any confusion on that, just reach out to your ATSD and they'd be more than happy to help you get that set up. Of particular note, I'm going to hit right here where it talks about on B. When you have international students, that's one of the biggest reasons that you might need to be recording for them. It's not exactly mentioned in here, but sort of a similar note to remember while we're on the subject of international or even different time zone students. Just make sure that you're watching for the students who don't plan on watching the recording, who do try to get there live. If they're in a different time zone, make sure you communicate which time zone that you are showing your stuff from. That way they can watch it whenever it is taking place. Another option to look at is uncounted unexcused absence days. I'm going to interrupt myself real quick to say, just a reminder, these are all suggestions. These are not mandates. This is the one that it's easy to quickly go, whoa, wait a second. I don't think this was going to work in my class. I was following you up to this one. Now you're just talking crazy. I can't do this with my students. It's okay. These are all suggestions. There are folks that are going to look at this one and go, boy, that does not work for me. Then there are other folks who are actually going to see this and go, no, that makes pretty good sense. It's okay if a student misses 1 or 2 days in my class, so long as they're staying on top of the material. This is the type of verbiage you could put in your syllabus. Students can take up to, let's say 3. Students can take up to 3 classes as uncounted, unexcused absence days in which they are not required to provide documentation for their absence, nor will the absence count against the participation grade. On this one, I always like to kind of compare the idea of the student uncounted, unexcused absence day as, put yourself in their situation. How many of these would you like to have? Now, I can't guarantee that you're going to get those, right? And maybe my answer for how many I would like to have is slightly more than I ought to be given, but maybe balance it somewhere between how many you would like and 0. So just think about, can you afford days whenever your students maybe don't necessarily have to be in class? It might be worth giving it to the student and saying, you know what, you get a pass on that day, or you get a pass on however many days. Scheduled office hours, conference days, reading days. Students will find on the weekly syllabus, this is what you put in your information you send to students. Students will find on the weekly syllabus a number of scheduled class sessions when we will not meet as a group, but when I will instead offer additional optional office hours for student instructor conferences, or I will schedule reading days to allow students to catch up or get ahead with coursework. What this means is maybe there's a day where you say to yourself, you know what, I think there are enough students that just need to talk one-on-one, that instead of having a typical in-class instruction, we're just going to have a time to chat as necessary, and students that need to make appointments can make appointments, or you could just even have some open time. Now, you'll notice I have, sorry, we're open on here. Here's the tricky thing about office hours. And if any of you have ever had office hours before, you know this. It's sort of a when it rains, it pours, but it feels like you're living in the desert. For some reason, and you know which times of the year this is, there are times when you have office hours and it is the most peaceful, calm time of your life. It's a great time for grading. It's a great time for rearranging furniture in your office. Maybe unhooking all those paper clips from the massive collection in your drawer. There are other times, like right whenever the semester is about to wrap up, that you could have 24 hours a day office hours and you still wouldn't have enough time to get through all the students. Maybe the students, if you sell this as an opportunity to get ahead or have an alternative to normal class, you can encourage some of those students to come in, use those office hours, get that one-on-one instruction time that they need, get that advice that they need, work through some of the stuff that they may not have been able to do in a large group setting. It's an alternative to a traditional class day. It's you opening up and saying, come on in, let's talk. Best case scenario, you help some students out. Worst case scenario, you finally get that rubber band ball finished. Additional in-person attendance. This one's a little confusing. When I was first looking through some of the suggestions that the university put out, my first thought was, wow, these people don't know anything about how students work, because my first thought was, all right, students, if you would like, you can come to class more often. I don't know very many students that would jump at that opportunity. My daughter is a very hard studying 5th grader who loves math, and I think she might. With the exception of her, I'm not sure very many students are ever going to say, yeah, I want to take an extra day to study. That's not really what this is talking about. What this is talking about is having a little bit of flexibility. What that means, and this is one to kind of be careful on, because we have our red days and we have our blue days. And while those red days and blue days are very important for us to be able to manage social distancing and the maximum number of students that can be in a classroom, you might find a time, and I'm sure many of you have seen this, that you can be a little more flexible than the red and blue days call for. For example, if you are on a red day, blue day schedule in your class, and you typically had 20 students in your classroom, red day, blue day now means you have on average an allotment for 10 students to be in your classroom. Some of you have found that if it is in the SMUFlex setup, or if you had enough students that have quarantined or isolated, you end up with 3 students in class. There might be a time where those 3 students from the 7 blue and the 4 students from the 8 red, there might be a time that one of them wants to go one day instead of another based on the number of seats that you have. That can still happen. You need to be able to work that out with the students, and you have to stay within the university's guidelines for social distancing. If you ever forget or you're ever unsure, my.smu.edu is a place where you can find that. You can know exactly what is how many students you can fit in your class and how many you can't. You still have to stay within the proper number, but there can be some flexibility in it when you start to see a classroom that maybe isn't as full as the maximum number allows. Studios and labs. There are some classes, and I know I went with the easy picture on this one, right? I went with the science lab. I just want to throw this out there and say, I know that it's more than just that, right? I know that I've missed out on so much of what Meadows is doing. I know that, whenever you have a group of students that are learning an instrument or learning a dance piece or learning a stage production, I understand that is studio and lab as well. So next time I do one of these, I'll put one of those pictures in. But there's a lot of hands-on learning that takes place in the university that just can't be done very well remote. There's specialized equipment needed, specialized locations needed, and then there are just some things that they just require you to be in the same room as someone else. If students have to miss a lab for a valid reason, they should probably still be able to earn credit, but set a limit on how many they can miss. Again, think about yourself and how many, if you were in this situation and you had to miss, due to health reasons, a certain number of studio or lab time, how much would you like to be able to miss? Remember, we're not going for all of them. We're going for a reasonable number where students are still getting their educational outcomes. A big thing to consider here is other ways that students can earn participation points. Making sure that the students are still prepared for the exams. Making sure that there's possibly an alternate way for students to cover the material. Look for other ways, and I know that for so many things, there's no true replacement for hands-on, but if you can get the student even to 50% of what they would have gotten for hands-on for that one time that they have to miss, that can be a huge improvement in their learning outcome. Keep in mind that documentation that we talked about earlier, that documentation is super, super important. Just like in class, students need to provide documentation for whenever they're going to be missing. The very same, students need to provide documentation for if they're going to be missing labs. Just because you tell students that they can miss 1 out of this semester's labs or 2 out of this semester's labs, I am not recommending you just throw that out there as a blanket statement. Instead, let them know that with proper documentation, with a valid excuse, they can miss the number of labs or studio times that you decide. Going all the way back to the beginning, keeping it timely, making sure it's official. Those are the two biggest things. Timely communication, the same thing that we have told our students for a long time. Let me know early if there's going to be a problem. The same thing we try to do for our students. Let them know early if there's going to be a problem. Continue that and make it even more true. And make sure that the students are sending the proper documentation. That's all the attendance stuff. Now, I'm actually going to stop sharing real quick and just jump back to me real quick to loop back to just real briefly talk again about recording your sessions. Recording your sessions can be really frustrating. It can be really nerve-wracking. It can be really scary. There's a certain aspect to recording a session that you are leading that it feels like, by me recording this, I am locking in whatever mistake I make for eternity. Number one, your students are used to you. They know the things that you say that make them laugh. They know the things that you say that make them frustrated. It's not going to be any different. They already know. They already appreciate you. They really do. They might forget to say it, but they do. A recording of it doesn't make it any worse, I promise. So don't be nervous about that aspect of it. Just understand that whatever frustrations there might be around recording, and the biggest frustration for me is remembering to record, whatever frustrations there might be around it, they are so much worth it when it comes to that student who comes to you and says, hey, I'm so sorry, I had to be out. Here's my documentation. I'm feeling better now. What can I do to get caught up? It's so much easier at that point to say, I have great news. I've got recordings for you, than to try to go back through the last 5 class sessions that they have not been there for. And now you have to remember what you said. Remember that excellent point that Rebecca said on Tuesday that you thought the whole class would benefit from hearing. Record those things. Save yourself so much time later. Set up automatic recording. If you're not sure how to do that, ask your ATSD, call the help desk. They can tell you how to set up automatic recording so that when you go on a Zoom session, it just records everything. You don't have to think about it anymore. So record your stuff. Make sure it gets recorded so that later you don't look back and go, boy, I wish I had kept that. Okay. It's 4:30-ish. We've got 15 minutes left. I've made it through all the material that we wanted to hit, but I'm sure that there's questions. I haven't taken a look at any of the chat yet. I'm sure Jennifer's been keeping an eye on it. Jennifer, what kind of questions do we have coming towards us?
Well, we just had one from Janice who asked if everyone is present, should she still record?
That's a great question. So that's when I kind of fall back to, you know, in an instance like that, per university guidelines, if every student is present, do you still have to record? It would be pretty easy to look at everything that the university says and go, it looks like I probably don't have to record if everyone is there. I would not like to find myself in a situation where I accidentally thought everyone was there, or someone has to leave early and I don't have the recording. I would just say, set your account to record everything, and then you don't have to worry about it. Especially because, and the thing that I have run into with recording of sessions is technology, as you all know, does not always work properly. There's a really good chance you're going to have one student who loses Wi-Fi or whose battery dies halfway through the session. Just get it recorded for them, because later they're going to need it just like someone who wasn't present.
So do we, since we're talking about on the subject of recording, do you need to split the recording of multiple sessions so students only get to see their section, or can you just, what do you do in that case when you have multiple sections of one class?
So I don't know there might be someone who could answer that better from a FERPA standpoint as to how that falls. I don't know as far as FERPA guidelines go. I know this just from a pedagogical standpoint. Short sections are almost always better for pedagogy. Think about the length of videos that you want to watch, the length of videos you want to sort through. I have the Lord of the Rings on Blu-ray, but I keep watching The Office. Well, I like Lord of the Rings better than The Office. Why? Well, because I don't really have 3 hours, but I do have 24 minutes. So try to keep your videos shorter. If you can think of a reason to trim your video down to a shorter instance, go ahead and trim it down. Those bite-sized pieces are way easier for people to digest.
All right. Then another question. So what we've talked about a lot so far is just the policies around attendance, but we haven't hit so much on strategies for taking attendance other than, you mentioned the running the report. So do you have any suggestions on strategies other than calling roll or running the report?
So there's a few that we have seen that are very successful. I'm going to go ahead and re-mention the pulling a report on a Zoom session, as it is fully reliable to get that report. There's never a problem with getting that report. It's something that is always there. Like I said from the beginning, as dependable as it is there, it's not super dependable when it comes to student engagement. How much do you really know about the student interacting with the material? None. So the two things on top of that that we have seen that are super beneficial are something that in the midst, whether that is a third of the way through, half of the way through, 2/3 at the very end, all throughout, interaction points, whether that's a poll that you create, whether that's a quiz that you create that students are able to interact with during the session. It's a good way to keep students interactive. There's also, I'm slow to spend too much time, I'm hesitant to spend too much time talking about calling on students or using students interacting with you verbally as a good way to, take attendance and capture student interaction, because we all know it's a bell curve, right? You have the students who will always talk, you have the students who will never talk, and then most of the students who will sometimes talk. So using student interaction, especially in any medium to large size class, is difficult. If it's a small class, it's a pretty good way. It's pretty easy if I have 8 students in a section, when that 6th and 7th and 8th student haven't said anything, to just talk to them one-on-one and get some reaction from them. But yeah, as far as quizzes go, as far as polls go, those are a great way to be able to do it. But the last one, and the one that I would say is probably your all-around best bet when it comes to really making sure that the students are truly engaged and that they're truly a part of it, whether it is live or whether it is through a recording, is scaffolding. Build what you are doing in the future off of what is discussed in class today. Build your discussions off what has been done and build your assignments off of what has been discussed. I had a professor in college who liked to read us chapters from the textbook he had written and then give us quizzes and tests from a completely different textbook. So you could ignore everything he said in class and do okay, so long as you took the practice quiz. Don't do that. Make sure your stuff that you're providing your students is meaningful, and that later, whenever they go to do the assignments, make them need what you're sharing with in those Zoom classes. Make it to where they are going to have to record. They're going to have to recall what you said. So those are a few ways to do it. I'm a big fan personally of just at some point having a poll. Even if it's just at some point in the class, just a fun poll. Maybe never tell your students that you're using it for attendance. Maybe just use it sometimes. Throw up a poll about who's going to win the Super Bowl and tell the students, hey, I need everybody to answer this poll. This is mandatory, and they'll groan and you'll go, no, it's important. I need this for myself. Make them answer that poll about who they think is going to win the Super Bowl. Give them an I don't care option. And then at that point, you know who's engaged and who's not. And those students that are not engaged, make it a conversation first. For the students who are not engaged, don't start off with, well, I counted you absent because you didn't answer my Super Bowl poll. Start off with, hey, I noticed you weren't interacting with us in class today. Were there any technology problems that you were having? Is everything okay? Because most of the time the student will go, oh, do I have to do that? And you go, yeah, you do. But then you might have a student that just says, oh, yeah, about that. I don't know, sorry. Hey, next time, make sure you're paying attention. Start with a conversation. It's a lot easier if you start with that.
How do students that are absent for valid reasons make up those interaction points?
So that's hard. Interactivity is hard once the moment has passed. There are a number of things such as discussion boards on Canvas. You have all been in classes before, whether they were professional development or whether they were whenever you were in school, or whether you were in school a long time ago or recently. You've at least had professional development recently where you had to post on a discussion board. And I'm going to bet right now that none of you went, yay, I get to post on the discussion board. Discussion boards are one of those things that when we have to post on them, we typically go, really? Do I really have to do this? I'm writing, because, we're all writing something way better than everyone else is, right? I poured my heart and soul into this, and everyone else was just like, that's cool. So understand that your students hate discussions board just as much as you do. That being said, if you use them properly, if you don't overuse them, if you make them meaningful, discussion boards can be all right. They can be a decent thing every once in a while. Maybe have a Friday discussion board posting, not a daily discussion board posting. I've been in classes with daily discussion boards. You have to make 2 posts and reply to 3 others. It's brutal. It's a beatdown. But also think of other ways to engage the students. We have ways of getting the students together other than just you lecturing and them listening to you lecture. Like it was mentioned before, that idea of the open office hours. Whenever you say, all right, let's get together, schedule a time for your class where you're going to get together and have a class discussion. If there are conversations that people missed before, that might be a good time to bring them in. Hey, before we talked about this, does anybody want to mention something more about that? I know there were some folks that mentioned that discussion. What was our decision on that one point? It's a great time to bring people in.
All right, it looks like I skipped over one from earlier. Are you able to show us, says, are we going to talk and show about recording who participated and for how long? So I know that it's hard to say exactly how much students are being engaged with those reports, but are you able to show us where you can check to see like when people log off, or do we have time for that?
So let me hit one thing first, which is you may have seen before Zoom's, what do they call it? It was Zoom, it was focus and it was loss of focus. Zoom could basically measure if you were no longer actively Zooming, you were kind of getting distracted by other things. That has actually been disabled by Zoom, that specific feature. So if you are looking for that, it is a good thing that that was disabled. Believe it or not, as much as an instructor as you might like to have that, it was pretty much spyware. So it is actually good that they're not running that anymore. It was watching far too much of what people were doing on their computer. So it is good that that is removed. While we would like to have it as instructors, it's good that it's gone. As far as the reports, I don't know that I have time to go in and run a report right now, but in the reporting, we'll get a list of how to run the reports. Instructions on how to run the reports sent out. In the reports, you can see when people log in, you can see when people log out, the total amount of time that they're in the class. And that's a good thing. Again, best to start with a discussion. It's best, if I see, hey, Sherry, I saw that you were a minute late for the class. That's probably a better discussion than I'm just going to count you absent. Especially you know, if it's just a little here or a little there, or a student who drops 5 minutes early, start with a discussion. But yeah, if you have that student that every day they're there for the first 22 minutes of class and then they're gone, that's when we move it up from a discussion to, I know you said you had a battery problem that one day, but after 4 days of having a battery issue, it's not a battery issue anymore. It's an attendance issue. The same way you want them to communicate early and often with you, communicate early and often with them. What else we got?
Just had some other people chime in with some suggestions on interaction points. Oh, here's one. So the expectation is to keep grades in Canvas. Can the poll be input into the Canvas grade sheet for attendance and participation grades? Whew.
So there's not a way to automatically have a Zoom poll get automatically pushed through to a Canvas grade, but that is when, you know, I always like to say, make it easier on yourself when you do these things. Try to work within the boundaries of what Canvas does. Think about things like, if you're going to take 10 of these in a semester, great. If you're going to take 11 of these in a semester, why did you just make things hard on yourself with that math? I don't ever want to do 11 of anything. I want to do 5 or 4 or 10. If you have 13 class sessions and you're going to take attendance on 13 of them, don't tell your students you're doing this. Just throw out 3 of them. Make it easier on yourself. That way, whenever you go to put those grades into Canvas, it's a lot simpler, because it's not that bad to go in and have to enter your own grades if they're nice numbers. Make it easier on yourself. At the end of the day, you're still going to capture the things that you need. You're still going to be able to find those students that need additional support because we're communicating with them. But you're also going to be able to find, you know, encourage those students to make it to class.
All right. Jason's asked, can you just use Canvas polls because they go into the gradebook, correct?
Yes. And a personal favorite of mine is keeping the students on their toes with how you take the polls. Not just taking the polls always in Canvas. There's a number of poll options available. Canvas polls go straight into the gradebook. If you tell the students, hey, let's pause for 1 minute and go take that Canvas poll, or you could even, another way that I've seen folks take attendance, and yes, students can work their way around it. I'll come back to that in just a second, is things like, okay, go in and fill out the Canvas poll, what picture I showed you all. Okay, thank you. Now, can students text that to each other? Sure. I hate to break it to you, but however much your students are trying to get around your attendance policy online, they were getting around policies the exact same way whenever you were in person. They were just doing it with different things. So at the end of the day, we are not taking attendance so that we can kick students out of our class. We're not taking attendance so that we can scare students. We're taking attendance so that we can identify students that need additional support. And when you see that those students need that additional support, that's when you reach out to them. But yeah, Canvas polls are great, and Canvas polls go straight into the grade book. That's the beauty of everything you can do inside of Canvas. Just goes straight into the grade book. It doesn't have to be moved.
Awesome. All right. Well, it is exactly 4:45, and we have reached the end of our questions. So nice job.
All right. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm glad that you all stuck around long enough for Jason to make his appearance at the end. Sorry he wasn't here to lead the whole thing, but you know, we take what we can get. Like I said, this recording will be posted up. You should be able to get to it, I believe, Monday. If that's not right, then, you know, not Monday. But the recording will be going up pretty soon. And these slides will be available for you as well. Other than that, reach out to your friendly neighborhood ATSD. We are always happy to help. Thanks, folks.